Carson Wade's hand froze on the brushed steel door handle of the executive break room, 20 floors above the San Francisco streets, where normal people conducted normal lives that made sense. His brain refused to process the scene unfolding 3 feet from where he stood, refused to reconcile the woman in the leather recliner with any version of reality he'd constructed during 2 years of writing code in the trenches below. Victoria Blackwell sat framed by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Bay Bridge, her charcoal Armani blazer draped over the armrest like discarded armor. The silk blouse beneath hung open enough to reveal what Carson's exhausted mind couldn't accept as possible. His son, 8-month-old Liam, nestled against her chest, nursing with an intensity that sent ice water through Carson's veins. This wasn't a bottle, wasn't the hypoallergenic formula he'd spent $200 on last week in another desperate attempt to get calories into his slowly starving child. This was something his mind categorized as biologically impossible, professionally catastrophic, and so far beyond appropriate that Carson couldn't locate the right emotion to feel. Victoria's eyes lifted slowly, locking onto his without moving her head, without disturbing the baby whose small hands clutched at the fabric of her blouse with desperate familiarity. Tears streamed down her face in thick lines that carved through makeup applied with the precision of someone who'd learned to build walls, one cosmetic layer at a time. Mascara pooled at her jawline. The expression she wore contained something Carson had never glimpsed in the ice queen of Silicon Valley, not during all-hands meetings where she delivered quarterly projections with the warmth of someone reading a phone book, not when she walked through the engineering floor with that trademark efficiency that made junior developers literally step backward into cubicles. This was raw grief, exposed need, a vulnerability so absolute it felt obscene to witness. Her lips barely moved, words emerging as broken whispers Carson almost didn't hear over blood pounding in his ears. "Please close the door. Lock it. I forgot to lock it." Carson's hand found the door handle through muscle memory alone, his conscious mind still 3 steps behind what his eyes reported. The lock clicked with a sound that seemed to echo through the silent room, and suddenly the world condensed to this impossible tableau. This CEO, worth more than most small nations, cradling his son while tears fell onto Liam's soft brown curls, while the baby nursed with focused contentment Carson hadn't witnessed in 240 days of watching his child reject every formula brand on the market. 20 minutes earlier, Carson had been drowning in code at his desk on the 15th floor, 3 Red Bulls deep into a debugging session that should have taken an hour, but had stretched into its 4th because the legacy system integration kept throwing errors nobody could explain. The delivery deadline sat 5 hours away, immovable as a boulder, because the sales team had promised the client a demo tomorrow morning, and failure wasn't an option when you worked at a company where missing deadlines added your name to the quarterly layoff spreadsheet. Liam had been with Nicole from the UX team, probably chewing on one of those silicone teething toys while she sketched wireframes. And Carson had allowed himself to sink into the zone where code became the only reality that mattered. Looking back now, he could identify the exact moment everything shifted, though he hadn't recognized it then. Tyler Brooks had wandered past his desk around 9:15, coffee mug in hand, mentioning something about Victoria taking Liam to the 20th floor. The words had registered at surface level only, filed away as background information, while Carson wrestled with a particularly nasty database query. Victoria Blackwell taking his baby upstairs didn't trigger any alarms because Liam had become the unofficial mascot of the entire engineering division. Passed between developers like a good luck charm, showered with attention from people who spent most of their lives staring at screens, and welcomed the excuse to interact with something small and warm and human. But Victoria Blackwell was different. Victoria Blackwell was the woman who had built TechVance from a seed-funded startup in a Palo Alto garage into a unicorn that dominated the enterprise AI software space, who had fired 300 people in a single day when the Series C funding fell through, who walked into board meetings and emerged with whatever she wanted through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance that made competitors nervous. Victoria Blackwell didn't do small talk in elevators, didn't attend the monthly happy hours, didn't interact with individual contributors beyond the occasional all-hands meeting where she delivered results with the emotional range of a quarterly earnings report. Carson had never spoken directly to her, not once in 24 months, because there were 8 layers of management between a senior engineer and the CEO, and those layers existed for reasons that seemed self-evident. The realization that something was profoundly wrong had arrived gradually, building through a series of small observations that accumulated into dread. 30 minutes passed, then 45, and when Carson finally extracted himself from the code long enough to check on Liam, Nicole said she'd handed the baby to Michelle 15 minutes ago. Michelle hadn't seen Liam in the last 20 minutes, thought maybe Tyler had him. Tyler was in a meeting. The chain of casual custody that usually worked perfectly suddenly revealed its gaps, and Carson felt his chest constrict as he moved through the floor, asking increasingly urgent questions that all led nowhere until someone mentioned seeing Victoria head toward the executive elevator with Liam sleeping against her shoulder. The executive elevator required a key card Carson didn't have, but the stairwell worked fine, even if it meant climbing 5 flights with his heart rate spiking. Not from exertion, but from growing certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. The 20th floor was sacred territory reserved for C-suite offices and the kind of conference rooms where acquisition deals got hammered out. Carson had never set foot there before today, had never needed to, because his world existed in the concrete realm of API endpoints and data structures, not strategic vision and shareholder value. The executive assistant stationed outside Victoria's office had been on the phone, barely glancing up as Carson moved past, and he'd followed the sound of silence to the break room at the end of the hall, expecting to find Liam asleep in a portable crib, or maybe crying while Victoria tried unsuccessfully to soothe him. Not prepared for anything close to the reality that ambushed him when he opened that door. Now standing with his back against the locked door while his son nursed from his CEO's breast, Carson experienced cognitive dissonance so profound it felt almost hallucinogenic. This couldn't be happening because it violated every professional boundary, every social norm, every assumption about how the world operated. But Liam's small body told a different story. The way he latched onto Victoria with the desperation of someone who'd been searching for exactly this for months, who'd been trying to tell Carson something through 8 months of rejected formula and weight percentiles that dropped steadily toward the danger zone where hospitalization became necessary. Victoria kept her eyes locked on his, still crying silently, not trying to hide or justify or explain, just waiting while Liam did what babies do when they finally find what their biology demands. The minutes stretched into something that felt like hours, time becoming elastic and strange in this room, where normal rules clearly didn't apply. Carson should have been angry, should have been horrified, should have been calculating how to report this to HR, or whether California law made this kidnapping or assault, or some category his mind couldn't name. Instead, he felt a collision of emotions so tangled he couldn't separate them into discrete threads, couldn't process anything beyond the simple observation that his son looked more content than Carson had ever seen him, more satisfied, more fundamentally okay than in 240 days of frustrated feeding attempts. The biological impossibility of what he was witnessing finally penetrated his shock enough to form words, though they emerged hoarse and uncertain. How is this even happening? Victoria took several deep breaths before responding, her voice raw in a way that suggested she'd been crying long before Carson opened the door. Let him finish, then I'll explain everything. I promise you'll understand, or at least I hope you will, because I know how this looks and I know what you must be thinking. Carson waited, sinking slowly down the door until he sat on the polished hardwood floor that probably cost more per square foot than his monthly rent, watching the impossible scene continue while his mind spun through scenarios and explanations that all fell apart under the weight of reality. Victoria was his boss, technically several layers removed, but still in his chain of command. Victoria was 42 years old, according to her Wikipedia page, which he'd read when TechVance's IPO made national news. Victoria was the ice queen of Silicon Valley, profiled in Forbes and Fast Company and Bloomberg, always photographed in severe black suits with her dark hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, never smiling, never revealing anything beyond calculated corporate messaging. This version of Victoria Blackwell existed in a completely different universe, vulnerable and broken, and doing something so intimate that Carson felt like a voyeur just by being present. But Liam was his son, and whatever was happening here demanded answers, even if those answers rewrote everything Carson thought he understood about professional boundaries and human behavior. Liam's nursing slowed after another 10 minutes, his small body gradually relaxing into the boneless satisfaction of a completely satiated infant. Victoria adjusted her hold carefully, supporting his head with practiced ease that suggested she'd done this before. And Carson filed that observation away, along with all the other impossible data points accumulating in his shell-shocked brain. She kept one hand cupped behind Liam's skull while she used the other to fix her blouse, movements economical and unself-conscious. And Carson found himself looking away, even though the moment for modesty had passed somewhere around the time he'd watched his son nurse from a woman who wasn't his mother. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice carried the careful control of someone trying to hold together something that wanted desperately to shatter. This was the most important thing that ever happened to me, what just occurred in this room. I need you to understand that before anything else, before you call security or HR or whoever you're already planning to call. Carson shifted against the door, his back aching from the awkward position, but he couldn't seem to move, couldn't break the strange gravity of this moment. I'm not calling anyone yet. I just need to understand what the hell is going on. Victoria looked down at Liam sleeping in her arms, peaceful in a way Carson recognized from the early days after Julia died, when his mother had flown out from Pittsburgh and somehow gotten the baby to sleep for 4-hour stretches, despite Carson's complete inability to manage more than 20 minutes before Liam woke screaming. Whatever had just happened had produced the kind of deep, satisfied sleep that only came when a baby's most fundamental needs had been met. And Carson couldn't ignore that evidence, even as every other part of his brain insisted this situation demanded immediate action. Victoria's next words emerged flat and dead, despite the tears that hadn't stopped falling. I lost my daughter last week. Her name was Emma. I made it to 18 weeks this time before my body decided it couldn't support life. 4th time. 4 pregnancies, 4 losses, each one taking a little more of whatever hope I had left. The information landed like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything Carson thought he knew about the woman holding his child. Victoria Blackwell had always seemed more like a force of nature than an actual human being, someone who existed on a different plane where normal concerns about relationships and family and biological imperatives didn't apply. The idea that she'd been carrying grief this massive while running a billion-dollar company, while firing people and closing deals, and projecting absolute confidence in quarterly earnings calls, seemed impossible until Carson remembered his own journey through the last 8 months, how he'd coded through funerals and debugged through nightmares, and somehow kept showing up to work, even when getting out of bed felt like climbing Everest. His voice came out smaller than intended. I didn't know. Victoria's laugh was bitter. Nobody knew. Nobody knows anything about me beyond what Forbes publishes. I've made sure of that, kept every personal detail locked down, because showing weakness in this industry gets you destroyed, gets you replaced by the board with someone younger and hungrier and willing to work 100 hours a week without the distraction of wanting things that normal people want. She shifted Liam slightly, her movements gentle and practiced, and Carson noticed for the first time how naturally she held him, how her body had adapted to accommodate his weight without conscious thought. The pregnancy hormones are still in my system. My body prepared for a baby that isn't coming, produced milk for a child I'll never feed. When I picked up Liam this morning, when he started fussing in that specific way babies do when they're hungry, something happened that I didn't plan or anticipate. The oxytocin flooded my system so fast, I actually felt dizzy. And suddenly my breasts were letting down milk, and Liam was rooting against my chest with this desperate urgency, and I acted on instinct instead of logic. Came up here, locked the door, and gave him what he was asking for. The clinical explanation somehow made the situation feel more surreal rather than less. Like Victoria was describing someone else's actions, some other woman who had crossed every conceivable line between appropriate and catastrophic. Carson tried to organize his thoughts into coherent responses, but everything kept fragmenting against the image of Liam, nursing with that desperate intensity, against the knowledge that his son had just received something Carson had assumed was lost forever. When Julia died on that operating table, while doctors shouted codes and nurses ran for equipment that arrived seconds too late. The question emerged harsher than Carson intended, sharp enough that Victoria flinched. "How long were you planning to do this without telling me?" Victoria's voice went quiet. "I wasn't planning anything. This wasn't calculated or premeditated. I picked up your son because he was crying and everyone else was busy, and my body responded in a way I couldn't control. And suddenly we were here, and it was happening, and I couldn't make myself stop because it felt like the universe was giving me one moment, one single moment, to experience what I've been trying to achieve for 6 years, through IVF and miscarriages, and fertility specialists who keep finding new ways to tell me my body is broken." The rawness in Victoria's voice cut through Carson's anger, exposing something underneath that looked a lot like his own grief, his own desperate scrambling to find meaning in loss that seemed senseless and cruel. Julia had been 26 years old, healthy, excited about motherhood in that cautious way people have when they've watched friends struggle through complications and stillbirths. The pregnancy had been textbook perfect, every checkup confirming that mother and baby were thriving, right up until the moment Julia's blood pressure spiked during labor, and the doctor started using words like eclampsia and cerebral hemorrhage and catastrophic. Carson had held his son for the first time while his wife died 6 feet away, had felt Liam's tiny fingers curl around his thumb while monitors flatlined, and a doctor he'd never met before delivered the information that would detonate his entire life. 8 months later, he was still figuring out how to exist in the aftermath, still learning to breathe through the moments when grief ambushed him in grocery store aisles, or during code reviews, or at 3 in the morning when Liam woke crying for a mother who would never come. The idea that Victoria Blackwell carried her own version of that devastation, had been functioning at the highest levels of corporate leadership while bleeding internally from losses nobody else could see, created an unexpected bridge between them that had nothing to do with org charts or pay grades. But practical concerns still demanded attention, demanded answers that didn't involve drowning in shared trauma. Carson's voice steadied. "I need to take him to the pediatrician. We have an appointment at 2. The doctor's been worried about his weight, about the formula rejection. I don't know what to tell her about this." Victoria nodded slowly, carefully transferring Liam to Carson's arms without waking him, and the loss that crossed her face when the baby left her embrace was so profound Carson had to look away. She stood with visible effort, reaching for her blazer, transforming back into the CEO with each breath, even though her eyes were still red, and her mascara had created dark smears along her cheekbones. Her voice regained some of its boardroom authority. "Tell her the truth. Tell her a woman who recently miscarried was holding your son and experienced spontaneous lactation due to hormone fluctuations. Tell her that your son nursed for approximately 35 minutes and fell into the deepest sleep you've seen in months. Tell her whatever medical facts are relevant to his care." Carson rose as well, cradling Liam against his chest while reaching for the door lock with his free hand. The baby's weight felt different somehow, more substantial, as if those 35 minutes had added density to his small frame. We're going to have to talk about this again, about all of this, because I still don't understand what just happened, or what it means, or what the hell I'm supposed to do with this information. Victoria met his eyes for a long moment, her expression settling back into the controlled mask Carson recognized from company meetings, though something in her gaze remained raw and exposed. I know, and I'll answer whatever questions you have, explain anything you need explained. But right now, take care of your son. Make sure he's healthy. That's what matters. The drive to Dr. Pierce's office passed in a blur of San Francisco traffic and racing thoughts that refused to organize into coherent patterns. Carson kept glancing at the rearview mirror, watching Liam sleep in the car seat with that same profound contentment, occasionally checking to make sure this was real and not some stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many energy drinks and too little sleep. The appointment had been scheduled for weeks, another in the long series of increasingly worried visits where Dr. Catherine Pierce documented Liam's failure to thrive, where percentile charts showed downward trajectories, and the specter of hospitalization loomed closer with each weigh-in that came back below expectations. Dr. Pierce had delivered hundreds of babies during her 20 years at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, had seen every variation of feeding difficulty and failure to thrive. But her expression when Carson explained what had happened suggested this particular scenario was new territory, even for someone with her experience. She listened without interrupting while Carson laid out the facts in chronological order, starting with finding Liam missing from the 15th floor and ending with Victoria's explanation about miscarriage and spontaneous lactation, trying to keep his voice clinical and detached even though the story felt insane coming out of his own mouth. Dr. Pierce's office had photographs on the walls showing her at various stages of her career, starting as a young resident in Atlanta and progressing through decades of practice that eventually brought her to California, to this pediatrics clinic where Carson had been bringing Liam since week 2 when the first formula experiments began failing. She removed her wire-rimmed glasses, cleaning them with methodical precision that suggested she was buying time to formulate a response. Her voice was measured when she finally spoke. Carson, the medical facts are straightforward enough. Women who experience late-term pregnancy loss can indeed produce milk due to sustained hormone levels, particularly if they were in the second trimester or beyond. The letdown reflex can be triggered by proximity to an infant, especially one actively seeking to nurse. From a nutritional standpoint, breast milk is incomparably superior to any formula on the market, which is why the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends exclusive breastfeeding for at least 6 months whenever possible. Carson heard the clinical information, processed it on an intellectual level, but his emotional response remained tangled and confused. But this isn't Julia breastfeeding our son. This is my boss. Someone I don't know beyond professional interactions. Someone who just did something that feels like it should be illegal, or at minimum, completely inappropriate. Dr. Pierce leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from clinical to something more personal, more grounded in the messy realities that medical textbooks didn't adequately address. Wet nursing has existed throughout human history, Carson. It was standard practice for centuries, continues to be common in many cultures today. The taboo around it is relatively recent and largely cultural rather than medical. From where I sit, looking at Liam's chart and the concerning trajectory we've been tracking for months, what happened today might have been the single most nutritious and beneficial experience of his entire life so far. The words landed with unexpected weight, reframing the situation in a way Carson hadn't considered while standing in that 20th floor break room watching his CEO cry. He'd been thinking about boundaries and appropriateness and what HR would say, Not about the simple biological fact that his son had just received exactly what his body had been desperately seeking for 8 months of frustrated formula rejection. Carson's admission came quietly. He's never nursed this well before. Julia died before she could even try breastfeeding. We went straight to formula in the hospital, and it's been a nightmare ever since. 4 different brands, 3 different bottle types, consultations with lactation specialists who had no solutions because there was no breast milk to work with. Watching him refuse food over and over while his weight dropped has been killing me slowly. And today he nursed for half an hour like it was the most natural thing in the world. Doctor. Pierce pulled up the growth charts, pointing to the curve that showed Liam hovering just above the 5th percentile for weight, dangerously close to the threshold where hospitalization became necessary. If this woman is healthy, if she's willing, and if Liam responds as positively as it sounds like he did, then from a purely medical perspective, this could solve the feeding crisis that's been threatening his development. The question isn't whether breast milk would benefit him. The answer to that is unequivocal, yes. The question is whether you're comfortable with the arrangement given the personal and professional complexities. Carson stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the hospital parking lot, watching cars navigate through the mid-afternoon traffic, while his brain tried to process information that seemed designed to short-circuit normal decision-making processes. Victoria Blackwell had just offered his son something irreplaceable, had given Liam access to nutrition his body desperately needed through an act that was simultaneously generous and boundary-violating, selfless and strange. The fact that it had emerged from her own grief and loss made it more complicated rather than less, added layers of emotional entanglement that Carson couldn't begin to untangle while standing in a pediatrician's office trying to figure out if his son was healthy or if this bizarre situation had just created new problems to replace the old ones. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. I need to talk to her again, need to understand if this was a one-time thing driven by hormones and grief, or if there's something more happening here that I should be aware of. Dr. Pierce nodded, making notes in Liam's chart that would document this appointment in ways that would probably baffle any future doctors who reviewed the records. Whatever you decide, make sure Liam continues getting adequate nutrition. His development depends on it. The feeding difficulties we've been tracking aren't sustainable long-term. Something needs to change, whether that's finding a formula that works or exploring alternative options. The drive back home took Carson through streets he knew by heart, past the taco trucks on Mission, and the murals in Clarion Alley, and the corner store where he bought emergency diapers at 2 in the morning when supplies ran low. His phone lit up with a call from Pittsburgh before he made it 3 blocks, and Carson hit the button for speakerphone without thinking. Maggie Wade's voice filled the car, carrying that particular tone of maternal concern that suggested she already knew something was wrong before Carson said a word. "Baby, you sound exhausted. What's happening?" Carson told her everything. The words spilled out in a confused rush that probably didn't make much sense, but captured the essential insanity of the day. Finding Liam missing, discovering Victoria nursing him, the medical explanation, Dr. Pierce's clinical assessment. He expected shock, maybe disapproval, possibly anger at this woman who had crossed lines without permission. What he got instead was silence, the kind of thoughtful quiet that meant his mother was actually processing instead of reacting, considering the situation from angles Carson hadn't thought to examine. When Maggie finally spoke, her voice carried memories of a rural Pennsylvania childhood Carson only knew through stories. "You know, your Grandma Ruth used to feed half the neighborhood babies back during the Depression years. Women helped each other raise children because that's what community meant. If your milk came in and your neighbor's baby was hungry while she was working the fields, you fed that child. Nobody thought twice about it because survival mattered more than whose breast the baby latched to." Carson hadn't expected that response, hadn't anticipated his mother reaching for cultural memory that predated modern anxieties about appropriate boundaries. That was a different time, Mom. This is my boss. We're talking about the CEO of the company. There are power dynamics and professional concerns, and 100 reasons why this could explode in my face. Maggie's laugh came dry and knowing, carrying decades of navigating corporate America as a hospital administrator who'd climbed from secretary to executive through sheer persistence. Baby, I understand power dynamics better than you think. I also understand that your son has been slowly starving for 8 months while you tried every solution modern medicine could offer. This woman just gave Liam something you couldn't provide, something his body desperately needed, and she did it from her own grief and loss. That's not power dynamics abuse. That's grace showing up when you least expected it. The words hit harder than Carson wanted to admit, exposing the fear underneath his concerns about appropriateness. The shame he'd been carrying about failing to solve Liam's feeding crisis through acceptable channels. He was supposed to be the provider, the protector, the father who could handle everything, even when everything felt impossible. Accepting help from his CEO, from a woman he barely knew, from someone whose own pain had somehow intersected with his son's needs, felt like admitting defeat in ways Carson wasn't ready to process. His voice came out defensive. What if she's not stable? What if this is some grief reaction that passes and leaves Liam dependent on something that disappears? Maggie's response was gentle but firm. Then you figure it out the same way you've been figuring everything else out since Julia died. But right now, today, your son is sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. That's not nothing, Carson. That's everything. Don't let pride or fear or professional concerns stop you from accepting a blessing just because it comes wrapped in uncomfortable packaging. Carson pulled into his apartment building's parking lot, finding his assigned spot while Liam continued sleeping in the back seat with that same profound contentment. The conversation with his mother had shifted something in his perspective, opened space for considering this situation from angles that weren't purely about boundaries and appropriateness. But accepting that shift meant having another conversation with Victoria, meant going back to that woman who just shattered every assumption Carson held about professional distance, and asking questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The rest of the afternoon crawled past with Carson accomplishing nothing productive, his attention fragmenting between the sleeping baby in the portable crib beside his desk and the 20 floors above where Victoria presumably sat in her corner office, making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. Around 5:30, as the office began its evening exodus toward parking garages and BART stations and buses that would carry people back to apartments and houses scattered across the Bay Area, Carson made a decision that felt simultaneously inevitable and terrifying. He packed up Liam's gear with mechanical precision, everything fitting into the oversized backpack that had become his constant companion, and walked to the elevator bank with his heart rate climbing toward levels usually reserved for sprint intervals or emergency room visits. The main elevator went to every floor, even if it meant enduring security protocols and checkpoints. And Carson rode it up to 20 with Liam stirring against his chest, the baby starting to wake from the afternoon nap that had lasted 4 hours longer than any previous sleep session in recent memory. The 20th floor reception area was emptier than it had been that morning, just Grace Winters at her desk outside Victoria's office, reading something on her computer with the intense focus that suggested end-of-day email processing. She looked up when Carson approached, her expression shifting through surprise and assessment before settling on professional neutrality. Her voice was carefully modulated. "Mr. Wade, Miss Blackwell isn't taking meetings today." Carson adjusted his grip on Liam, who was starting to fuss in that particular way that meant hunger was imminent. "I think she'll want to see me. It's about this morning." Something flickered across Grace's face. Recognition or understanding, or maybe just the awareness that whatever was happening here fell outside her job description. She picked up her phone, spoke quietly into it, listened for a moment, then gestured toward the heavy oak door that led to the corner office Carson had only seen in company press releases. Grace's words were simple. She says to come in. Victoria's office occupied the northwest corner of the building, windows on two walls offering views of the Bay Bridge and fog rolling through the Golden Gate in thick banks that would blanket the city by nightfall. The furniture was minimalist and expensive, steel and glass and leather in shades of black and charcoal. No personal photographs or decorative touches beyond a single white orchid on the credenza that looked professionally maintained, like everything else in Victoria Blackwell's carefully constructed world. Victoria sat behind her desk reviewing documents, and she didn't look up immediately when Carson entered, didn't acknowledge his presence until he'd crossed half the distance to her desk, and stopped, uncertain whether to sit or stand or speak first. When she finally raised her eyes, Carson saw exhaustion that went bone deep, the kind of weariness that no amount of sleep could fix, because it came from carrying weight that never got lighter. Her voice was flat, more controlled than it had been in the break room, but carrying undertones of something fragile. I thought you might come back. She gestured to one of the leather chairs across from her desk. Sit, please. Carson settled into the chair, positioning Liam on his lap so the baby could see around the office, taking in the world from his father's arms with wide eyes that suggested full awareness despite being barely 8 months old. The silence stretched for several seconds before Carson found his voice, organizing thoughts that still felt jumbled and uncertain, despite hours of mental processing. His words came measured. I talked to the pediatrician and my mother. I've been thinking about what happened this morning for the last 6 hours. Victoria closed the folder in front of her with precise movements, giving Carson her full attention in a way that felt almost overwhelming, like standing in a spotlight that revealed every flaw and inadequacy. And what conclusions did you reach? Carson took a breath, choosing words carefully. That I don't understand what happened or why it happened the way it did. But I can't deny that Liam responded to you in ways he's never responded to formula. That the pediatrician confirmed breast milk would be incomparably better for his development than anything I can buy in a store. That my mother reminded me wet nursing used to be normal before modern society decided it was weird. He paused, watching Victoria's expression for reactions that remained carefully controlled, giving nothing away. But I also need to know if this was a one-time thing driven by grief and hormones, or if there's something else happening here that I should understand before I make any decisions about my son's welfare. Victoria stood, moving to the window that overlooked the bridge, her posture rigid in a way that suggested she was holding herself together through conscious effort. When she spoke, her voice carried layers of pain that made Carson's chest tighten in unwanted sympathy. The words came slowly, each one chosen with care. I've lost 4 babies in 6 years, 4 pregnancies that ended in different kinds of devastation, each one taking something I can't get back. Last week, I lost Emma at 18 weeks after spending 4 months believing this time would be different. This time my body would cooperate. This time I'd finally get to experience motherhood instead of just failing at it repeatedly. She turned to face Carson, and the control in her expression had started to crack, showing the grief underneath like fault lines in stressed concrete. When I held your son this morning, when my body responded by producing milk, when he latched on and nursed like he'd been waiting his entire life for exactly that, I felt what I've been chasing for 6 years. I felt needed. I felt capable. I felt like maybe all this suffering had some purpose beyond just destroying me slowly. The honesty in her words created a space Carson hadn't expected, an opening for something that looked almost like understanding, despite the massive gap between their lives and experiences. He watched Victoria struggle with emotions she clearly wasn't accustomed to expressing. Watch the Ice Queen melt into someone recognizably human and hurting. Her next words came quieter, but no less intense. I can't give you guarantees about hormones, or how long my body will produce milk, or whether this makes any kind of sense from a rational perspective. What I can tell you is that feeding your son today was the most important thing I've done in my entire life, more meaningful than any deal I've closed or any company I've built. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to continue. Not as your boss, not as some corporate arrangement, but as someone who desperately wants to experience at least part of motherhood, even if it's not with my own biological child. Carson looked down at Liam, who had started reaching for his face with chubby hands, babbling nonsense syllables that were slowly developing toward actual words. 8 months of watching his son struggle had taught Carson to recognize when Liam was thriving versus merely surviving. And the difference today was undeniable. The baby who had screamed through every formula feeding and spent hours crying from hunger his father couldn't satisfy had become calm and content after 35 minutes at Victoria's breast, had slept more peacefully than Carson had ever witnessed, had woken alert and engaged instead of fussy and irritable. The decision forming in Carson's mind felt insane and reckless, and completely contrary to every professional instinct he'd developed during his career. It also felt right in some way he couldn't articulate, like the universe was offering a solution that didn't fit any conventional category, but addressed needs that went deeper than organizational charts or corporate hierarchies. His voice was steady when he spoke. If we do this, it can't be here. It can't be at the office where people will see and speculate and turn it into something it's not. And we need to be honest about what this is and what it isn't, completely clear on boundaries and expectations. Victoria returned to her desk, sitting down with visible relief as if Carson's words had removed weight she'd been carrying since morning. I understand. My penthouse isn't appropriate either. Too much staff, too many security cameras, too many ways this could leak and become a story that destroys both of us. Carson nodded, already thinking through logistics that felt surreal to be considering. Your apartment? The correction came automatic. My apartment, Mission District, 2-bedroom, nothing fancy but it's private. You could come after work, stay for however long Liam needs. We keep this between us until we figure out if it's sustainable. They discuss details with the same efficiency they might bring to a project kickoff meeting, establishing schedules and expectations and boundaries that felt necessary even if the entire conversation existed in territory neither of them had ever navigated before. Victoria would come by at 6 each evening, stay until Liam had nursed and fallen asleep, then leave before the situation could drift into territories that complicated an already impossible arrangement. They would maintain complete professionalism at the office. No special treatment, no acknowledgement of what was happening outside work hours. If questions arose, they would handle them honestly but carefully, protecting both Liam's well-being and their own privacy. By the time Carson left her office, darkness had settled over San Francisco completely, the city lights creating patterns that stretched toward distant hills, barely visible through the fog. He carried Liam through the empty 20th floor toward the elevator, past Grace's now vacant desk, feeling like he just negotiated the strangest agreement of his life. Tomorrow, Victoria would show up at his apartment, would cross the threshold between professional and personal in ways that should feel threatening but somehow didn't, would continue giving his son what Carson couldn't provide through an arrangement that existed outside every category he understood. The thought should have terrified him, should have sent him running to HR or legal counsel or anyone who could explain why this was a catastrophically bad idea. Instead, Carson felt something closer to cautious hope, the first genuine optimism he'd experienced since watching Liam's weight percentiles drop toward dangerous territory, while every formula brand on the market proved equally useless. He thought about Julia as he drove home through streets he knew by heart, wondering what she would make of this situation, whether she'd approve or be horrified, or simply understand that sometimes survival requires accepting help from unexpected places. They'd talked about breastfeeding during the pregnancy, Julia determined to try despite horror stories from friends about painful latching and inadequate supply and judgmental lactation consultants. She'd never gotten the chance, had died before holding Liam long enough to attempt feeding him, and Carson had assumed that particular door had closed permanently the moment the monitors flatlined. Now it had opened again through the last person Carson would have predicted, through his CEO's grief intersecting with his son's desperate needs in ways that felt almost supernatural in their timing. Victoria Blackwell was suffering losses Carson could barely comprehend, carrying pain that had accumulated over years of failed attempts to achieve what most women took for granted. She'd built an empire, had created something that would outlast her, but the one thing she actually wanted kept slipping through her fingers, no matter how much money or willpower or strategic thinking she applied. And somehow, in this impossible collision of their separate griefs and needs and failures, they'd stumbled into an arrangement that might actually work, that might solve Liam's feeding crisis while giving Victoria a taste of the motherhood she'd been chasing for 6 years. It was messy and complicated and violated every professional boundary Carson had been taught to maintain. But it was also the first genuine solution he'd found in 8 months of watching his son suffer. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own adjustments, its own moments of awkwardness and uncertainty as they figured out how to navigate this arrangement. But tonight, Liam slept peacefully in his car seat, properly fed for the first time since birth, and Carson could hear his son's steady breathing, even over the sound of traffic and city noise filtering through the windows. That simple fact mattered more than organizational charts or power dynamics or concerns about what other people might think if they knew. Carson pulled into his building's parking lot, finding his spot in the structure beneath the modest 3-story walk-up that had been his home since Julia died. He gathered Liam in the overstuffed backpack, climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, and unlocked the door to the apartment that held 8 months of memories, some good, most hard, all marking the journey of a father learning to survive alone. That night, preparing Liam for bed with the same routine he'd followed since bringing the baby home from the hospital, Carson noticed differences, subtle enough that he might have imagined them if he weren't looking so carefully. Liam settled into sleep easier, fussed less during the diaper change, seemed generally more content in ways that probably came from having a full belly for the first time in months. Carson sat in the rocking chair beside the crib long after Liam dozed off, watching his son sleep while processing a day that had started normally and ended somewhere completely beyond his ability to map. Tomorrow, Victoria Blackwell would knock on this door, would enter his private space, would nurse his child in his living room while they figured out if this arrangement was sustainable or insane or possibly both. The thought carried weight that pressed against Carson's chest, made breathing feel like conscious effort rather than autonomic function. But when he looked at Liam sleeping with that profound peace, when he remembered the pediatrician's words about breast milk being incomparably superior, when he heard his mother's voice reminding him that blessings don't always arrive in expected packaging, Carson knew he'd made the right choice. Crazy, inappropriate, potentially catastrophic, but right. Victoria arrived at Carson's apartment at 6:15 the following evening, standing in the hallway outside his door with the tentative posture of someone entering completely foreign territory. She'd changed from the severe black suit into dark jeans and a simple cashmere sweater the color of charcoal, her hair down for the first time Carson had ever witnessed, falling past her shoulders in waves that made her look younger and somehow more vulnerable. The transformation from Ice Queen CEO to nervous woman about to cross an intimate threshold was so complete that Carson almost didn't recognize her when he opened the door. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Come in. Liam's been fussy for the last hour. I think he knows you're coming." Victoria stepped into the cramped living room, taking in the space with eyes that probably compared it automatically to her penthouse with its panoramic views and designer furniture. Carson's apartment was clean, but cluttered with the accumulated chaos of single fatherhood. Baby gear occupying every available surface, laundry folded on the couch because the bedroom was too small for proper organization, sippy cups and teething toys creating obstacle courses across the hardwood floor. She didn't comment on the modest surroundings, just set her bag down carefully and held out her arms when Liam started reaching for her with urgent little sounds that weren't quite crying, but suggested he'd get there soon if his needs went unmet. The transition was immediate and striking. Liam settled against Victoria's chest, rooting with the same desperate focus Carson had witnessed yesterday, and within seconds he'd latched on and began nursing with intensity that suggested his body remembered exactly what had happened in that 20th floor break room. Victoria sank into the rocking chair Carson had positioned by the window, her entire frame relaxing as Liam fed, and Carson busied himself in the kitchen area, pretending to clean dishes that were already clean, because watching this felt too intimate despite having agreed to the arrangement. They didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. Victoria focused entirely on Liam, while Carson moved between kitchen and living room, with manufactured tasks that kept his hands busy and his eyes mostly averted. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, more like the cautious quiet of two people navigating new territory without a map, figuring out boundaries through trial and error rather than explicit discussion. Eventually, Carson ran out of things to pretend to organize and settled on the couch with his laptop, pulling up code reviews that needed completion before tomorrow's stand-up meeting. His concentration lasted approximately 30 seconds before fracturing against the awareness of Victoria nursing his son 15 feet away, the soft sounds of Liam's contentment mixing with the distant hum of Mission District traffic filtering through windows that didn't quite seal properly. Victoria's voice broke the quiet, low to avoid disturbing Liam. "You can relax. I know this is strange, but we might as well accept that strange is our new normal." Carson closed the laptop, accepting that productive work wasn't happening while his CEO sat in his apartment doing something that rewired every assumption about professional boundaries. "How long does your doctor think the milk will last? The hormones from the miscarriage?" Victoria shifted slightly, adjusting Liam's position with practiced ease that suggested muscle memory was building faster than conscious skill. She wasn't sure. Could be 2 weeks, could be 2 months. The body doesn't follow predictable timelines when it comes to pregnancy loss. Some women dry up immediately. Others produce milk for months afterward, especially if there's regular stimulation. The uncertainty inherent in that answer troubled Carson more than he wanted to admit. Because if Liam became dependent on Victoria's milk, only to have it disappear abruptly, they'd be back in the same crisis that had nearly required hospitalization. Only worse, because now his son knew what he was missing. But voicing that concern felt ungrateful given what Victoria was offering. So Carson filed it away, along with all the other anxieties accumulating around this arrangement. His next question emerged more tentative. "What made you pick him up yesterday? Out of all the times Liam's been at the office, you'd never shown interest before." Victoria's expression shifted, memories crossing her face that carried visible pain. "I heard him crying from my office. The sound cut through a conference call about Q3 projections, and suddenly nothing else mattered except getting to that baby. I told the board I'd call them back and went down to the 15th floor without really thinking about why." She paused, watching Liam nurse with an expression that mixed wonder and grief in equal measure. "When I picked him up, something clicked in my body that I wasn't prepared for. The oxytocin response was so overwhelming, I actually felt lightheaded. Like my brain chemistry completely rewrote itself in the span of 30 seconds. Another pause, longer this time. "I've held babies before at company events when executives bring their families. It never affected me like this, never triggered anything beyond polite interest. But Liam was different. Or maybe my body was different because of Emma. Or maybe the universe just decided that particular moment was when everything would align in the worst and best possible way simultaneously." Carson absorbed this, adding it to his growing understanding of how grief operated, how it could ambush people in conference calls and turn ordinary moments into turning points that rewrote entire life trajectories. His own experience with loss had taught him that trauma didn't follow logical patterns, didn't restrict itself to appropriate times and places, could erupt during code reviews or grocery shopping or any random Tuesday when the weight became too much to carry alone. The evening established a pattern that would repeat with minor variations over the following days. Victoria would arrive around 6, nurse Liam for 30 to 45 minutes while Carson worked on his laptop or cooked dinner, then stay another hour while the baby dozed and they talked about topics that started professional and gradually drifted personal. She told him about growing up in Detroit, about her father who'd worked at the Ford plant until the layoffs came and took his sobriety with him, about learning to code in the public library because home wasn't safe when her father was drinking, and computers offered escape into worlds that made sense. Carson shared his own history, the Pittsburgh neighborhoods where his mother had raised 3 boys on an administrator's salary after their father died in a construction accident when Carson was 12. The basketball scholarship that got him into Berkeley when his grades alone wouldn't have been enough. Meeting Julia at Highland Hospital when he'd broken his wrist going for a rebound, and she'd been the nurse who wrapped his arm while teasing him about thinking he was LeBron James, her laugh making the pain almost worth it. By the end of the first week, the awkwardness had faded enough that they could exist in the same space without constant awareness of how bizarre this situation would look to outside observers. Liam thrived in ways that became undeniable when Carson took him for the follow-up appointment with Dr. Pierce, and the scale showed 3 pounds gained in 7 days, a growth rate that moved him from the 5th percentile towards something approaching normal range. Dr. Pierce documented the improvement with professional detachment, asking questions about feeding frequency and duration that Carson answered honestly while deliberately avoiding details about who was providing the milk. The lies of omission sat heavy in his chest, but the alternative, explaining that his CEO was wet nursing his son, seemed likely to trigger mandatory reporting protocols or ethics investigations that would destroy the arrangement before it had a chance to prove sustainable. The second week brought the first real complication, though it arrived wrapped in such mundane packaging that Carson almost didn't recognize it as a threat. Nicole from the UX team mentioned during a code review that she'd noticed Victoria leaving the building around the same time as Carson several evenings in a row, wondered aloud if they'd been assigned to some special project that required after-hours collaboration. Carson deflected with vague statements about consulting on a personal matter, but the question planted seeds of concern about how long they could maintain this arrangement before someone noticed patterns and started asking questions that had no good answers. That evening, he mentioned the conversation to Victoria while she settled into the rocking chair with Liam, already rooting urgently against her shoulder. His voice carried tension he couldn't quite hide. "We need to be more careful about timing. People are starting to notice we leave at the same time." Victoria adjusted her sweater, helping Liam latch on while considering the problem with the same strategic thinking she probably applied to competitive analysis and market positioning. "I can vary my departure time, make it less predictable. Maybe come here straight from external meetings some days, so I'm not leaving from the office at all. We could stagger by 30 minutes minimum." They worked through logistics like they were planning a product launch instead of hiding an arrangement that would probably get them both fired if HR discovered the truth. The conversation revealed how much mental energy they were both investing in maintaining secrecy, in protecting something that felt simultaneously precious and impossible to defend if anyone demanded explanations. Carson found himself wondering how long they could sustain this level of careful coordination before exhaustion or carelessness created cracks where truth could leak through. The third week marked a shift in their relationship that Carson noticed but couldn't quite name. Victoria started arriving earlier, staying later, finding reasons to extend the evenings beyond the strictly necessary time required for Liam to nurse. She'd help with dinner preparation, chopping vegetables while Carson handled the stove, their movements in the cramped kitchen developing a rhythm that came from repeated practice. They'd eat together after Liam fell asleep, talking about everything from TechVance's upcoming product launch to Victoria's failed IVF attempts to Carson's memories of Julia that were starting to hurt less sharply even as they remained permanently tender. One Thursday evening, while Victoria washed dishes and Carson dried, she told him about her ex-husband with a flatness that suggested she'd processed this grief long enough that it had lost its immediate sting. Her voice was matter-of-fact as she explained how Bradley had left after the second miscarriage, said he couldn't watch her destroy herself chasing something that clearly wasn't meant to happen, how he'd expected her to choose him over the possibility of motherhood, to accept childlessness and move on with their lives together as if that were a reasonable ask. Victoria's hands stilled in the soapy water. When I couldn't do that, when I kept pursuing fertility treatments despite the emotional and physical toll, he decided I'd made my choice. Filed for divorce 3 months later, married someone else within a year. They have twins now, apparently. Carson set down the plate he'd been drying, giving her his full attention because this felt important, in ways that went beyond casual conversation. Did you ever regret it? Choosing the treatments over the marriage? Victoria turned off the water, drying her hands on the towel with deliberate movements that bought her time to formulate an answer. Every day for the first year, then gradually the regret transformed into something else. Not quite acceptance, but maybe understanding that some people aren't built to carry other people's grief alongside their own. Bradley needed a partner who could compartmentalize loss, who could try for a baby and then move on when it didn't work, instead of letting each failure compound into something that consumed everything. She looked at Carson with an expression that held both vulnerability and strength, acknowledging pain without being destroyed by it. I couldn't be that person. Can't be that person. When I want something, I pursue it with everything I have, which is probably why I built $1 billion company, but also why I've lost 4 pregnancies without learning when to stop trying. The honesty in her words created intimacy that had nothing to do with the physical act of nursing Liam, a different kind of closeness built from shared understanding of what it meant to want something desperately while watching it slip away repeatedly. Carson recognized the pattern from his own experience with grief. The way loss didn't diminish just because time passed, how absence could become a permanent presence that shaped every decision and perspective. His own admission came quietly. Julia used to say I loved too hard, that I needed to learn how to want things casually, to care less intensely so disappointment wouldn't hit as brutally. She was probably right, but I don't know how to be any other way. Victoria smiled, a real smile that transformed her face completely, erasing the Ice Queen mask to reveal someone younger and more approachable underneath. Maybe that's why we ended up here. 2 people who can't do anything halfway, who commit completely even when the smart move would be protecting ourselves. The moment stretched between them, charged with recognition that felt dangerous in its implications. Carson broke eye contact first, returning to the dishes with renewed focus, because acknowledging the connection forming between them meant confronting questions about where this arrangement was heading beyond the immediate, practical concerns about Liam's nutrition. By the 4th week, Victoria had become such a regular presence in Carson's apartment that Liam would start fussing around 6, regardless of whether he was actually hungry, his internal clock apparently calibrated to expect her arrival. The baby's development had accelerated dramatically, reaching milestones that Dr. Pierce documented with professional satisfaction while carefully avoiding questions about the specifics of Liam's feeding routine. Carson watched his son transform from the listless infant who'd barely responded to stimulation into an engaged, alert baby who smiled readily and babbled constantly, reaching for toys with improving coordination and sleeping through most nights in stretches that allowed Carson to function like a semi-normal human being. But success brought its own complications, particularly around the question of sustainability. Victoria's milk production showed no signs of decreasing, despite medical literature suggesting that continued stimulation could maintain lactation indefinitely if demand remained consistent. The implication was clear. This arrangement could continue as long as they wanted it to, which raised questions neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Late one Friday evening after Liam had dozed off, and Victoria was gathering her things to leave, Carson finally asked the question that had been building for weeks. What happens when this stops being just about feeding Liam? When it becomes something more complicated than a practical arrangement? Victoria froze with her bag half packed, her back to Carson, and the silence that filled the apartment felt heavy with implications neither of them had been willing to name aloud until now. When she turned to face him, her expression mixed fear and hope in ways that probably mirrored Carson's own tangled feelings. Her voice came soft, almost fragile. I don't know. I know we said this was just about Liam's nutrition, just a temporary solution to a medical crisis. But somewhere along the way, it became the most important part of my day. The thing I look forward to more than anything happening at work or anywhere else in my life. Carson stood, closing the distance between them until only a few feet separated their positions in the small living room where they'd spent 4 weeks building something that didn't fit any category either of them understood. His words came out rougher than intended. You're my boss. You're 14 years older than me. Everyone would say I'm taking advantage, or you're abusing your power, or this whole situation is completely inappropriate. Victoria held his gaze, not flinching from the uncomfortable truth in his words. I know all of that. Know what it would look like if anyone found out, how it would destroy both our careers and probably get me removed as CEO. But I also know that I've never felt more like myself than I do here in this cramped apartment with you and Liam, doing something that has nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market share or any of the metrics that supposedly define success. The vulnerability in her admission broke something loose in Carson's chest, some final resistance to acknowledging what had been growing between them alongside the practical arrangement about feeding his son. The words felt inevitable when they finally emerged. I think I'm falling in love with you. I know that's insane. I know it complicates everything, but I can't keep pretending this is just about Liam when you're the first person I've wanted to see every day since Julia died. Victoria closed the remaining distance, her hand finding his with a tentative touch that asked permission while offering connection. I've been in love with you for 2 weeks, tried to deny it, tried to convince myself this was just about filling the void Emma left. But that's not what this is. You make me feel seen in ways nobody has since before I became successful enough that people only saw the company or the money or the reputation. Carson pulled her into an embrace that felt simultaneously natural and earth-shattering, Victoria's frame fitting against his in ways that suggested they'd been moving toward this moment since she'd walked into his apartment 4 weeks ago. They stood holding each other while Liam slept peacefully in the bedroom, while the San Francisco night settled over the city outside. While everything they'd been carefully not discussing finally found expression in physical contact that promised complications neither of them could fully anticipate. Carson's voice was muffled against her hair. We can't do this at work. Can't give anyone ammunition to claim this is about power dynamics or favoritism. Victoria pulled back enough to meet his eyes, her expression serious despite the tears gathering at the corners. Complete professionalism at the office. No special treatment, no acknowledgement of anything happening outside working hours. If anything, I should probably be harder on you than other engineers to avoid any appearance of preferential treatment. They both recognized the inherent absurdity of negotiating professional boundaries while standing in an embrace that had already demolished most conventional definitions of appropriate executive-employee relationships. But the attempt itself mattered, the effort to establish rules that might protect them if this situation eventually exploded in their faces. Carson kissed her then, tentative at first, and then with growing confidence as Victoria responded with equal intensity. 4 weeks of accumulated tension finding release in physical connection that felt overdue and terrifying in its implications. When they finally separated, breathing hard, Carson recognized that they just crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, that this arrangement had officially become something far more complicated than a practical solution to Liam's feeding crisis. Victoria must have reached the same conclusion because she stepped back, creating physical distance while her expressions cycled through emotions too complex to name. I should go. Need to think about what this means, how we navigate it without destroying everything we've built. Carson nodded, understanding the need for space, even as part of him wanted her to stay, to keep talking through implications and complications until they'd mapped every possible consequence. But some things needed processing alone, in the quiet hours when brutal honesty became possible without the distraction of another person's presence. Victoria gathered her things with movements that had lost their earlier efficiency, her hands slightly unsteady as she packed her bag and checked her phone and prepared to return to whatever penthouse apartment awaited her across the city. At the door, she paused, looking back at Carson with an expression that mixed joy and terror in equal measure. Her words were simple. Same time tomorrow? Carson managed a smile that felt shaky but genuine. Liam will be waiting, so will I. After she left, Carson stood in the center of his living room, processing what had just happened, what they'd just acknowledged, what doors they'd opened that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could fully predict. He checked on Liam, confirming the baby slept peacefully, despite the emotional earthquake that had just restructured his father's world. Then moved to the window where he could see Victoria's Tesla pull out of the parking lot below, red taillights disappearing into San Francisco traffic. The smart move would be pumping the brakes, establishing firm boundaries, maybe even ending the arrangement before emotional entanglement made everything impossible to untangle. But Carson had never been good at smart when it contradicted what his heart demanded, had never learned how to want things casually or protect himself from potential devastation. He was all in or all out, committed completely or not at all. And somewhere in the last 4 weeks, he'd committed to Victoria Blackwell in ways that went far beyond agreeing to let her nurse his son. Saturday brought new complications when Maggie called from Pittsburgh, her voice carrying the particular quality that meant she'd been worrying about something and finally decided intervention was necessary. Carson settled onto the couch with Liam playing on a blanket at his feet, toys scattered in the chaos that marked weekend mornings, and braced himself for whatever question his mother had been building toward. Her directness caught him off guard, despite knowing it was coming. Baby, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, even if the answer is complicated. Are you developing feelings for this woman, this Victoria who's been helping with Liam? Carson hadn't considered lying to his mother, hadn't ever successfully managed it in 28 years. But the question still made him pause mid-diaper change. His voice came out more defensive than intended. What makes you ask that? Maggie's laugh carried dry amusement. Carson Alexander Wade, I've been your mother for 28 years. I know when you're falling for someone based on how your voice changes when you talk about them. Every time you mention Victoria, you sound like you did when you first met Julia. Like the whole world just got brighter and more complicated simultaneously. Carson closed his eyes, accepting that lying to his mother had never worked and wouldn't start working now, despite the distance between Pittsburgh and San Francisco. I kissed her last night, told her I was falling in love with her. She said she felt the same way. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Carson started worrying the connection had dropped. But then Maggie spoke with the careful tone she used when delivering hard truths, wrapped in love. Baby, I understand loneliness, understand wanting connection with someone who sees you beyond the grief and the single parenthood and all the weight you've been carrying. But this woman is your boss, has power over your career, and there's no version of this that doesn't get complicated in ways that could hurt you badly. Carson watched Liam grab a plastic ring and try to fit it in his mouth, drooling contentedly, completely unaware that the adults around him were navigating emotional minefields. I know all the reasons this is a bad idea, Mom. Know it could explode my career. Know the age gap means we're in different life stages. Know that starting a relationship under these circumstances is probably the worst decision I could make right now. He paused, finding words for feelings that still felt too new to articulate completely. But she makes me feel alive again in ways I haven't felt since Julia died. Makes me remember that I'm more than just Liam's father, more than a grief-stricken widower trying to survive. When I'm with her, I can breathe fully instead of just taking shallow breaths to get through the day. Maggie's sigh carried 3,000 miles of maternal concern and understanding fighting for dominance. Then I won't tell you not to pursue it because you're a grown man who gets to make his own choices, even when those choices scare his mother. But I will tell you to be careful, to protect yourself, and to remember that Liam needs you stable more than he needs you in love. They talked for another 20 minutes about logistics and timelines and what Carson would do if the situation fell apart. Maggie extracting promises about maintaining boundaries at work and having exit strategies if things deteriorated. By the time they hung up, Carson felt both supported and more anxious about the path he'd chosen, his mother's concerns adding weight to worries he'd been trying to suppress through sheer force of optimism. The following Monday brought the first visible crack in their carefully maintained professional facade. Karen Mitchell from HR called Carson for what she termed a routine check-in about workplace satisfaction, but the questions felt anything but routine. Her voice carried bureaucratic neutrality as she asked about work-life balance, concerns about management interactions, whether he'd noticed any unusual executive behaviors. Carson deflected with vague responses, but the subtext was clear. Someone had reported something, had noticed patterns or made connections that triggered HR's radar. That evening, he told Victoria about the conversation while she settled into the rocking chair, with Liam already latching on urgently. His words came tense. HR is fishing. They don't know specifics yet, but someone's talking. Victoria's face paled, even as she maintained her focus on Liam. The board has been asking questions too. They noticed I've been leaving early, cutting meetings short. Blake Huntington mentioned it during our last quarterly review, wondering if everything was okay, if I needed to delegate more responsibility. The name Blake Huntington sent warning signals through Carson's nervous system. Huntington was the activist investor who'd been pushing for leadership changes since TechVance missed last quarter's revenue targets by 8%. He had the backing to force Victoria out if he could build a case for incompetence or inappropriate conduct. Victoria's next words confirmed Carson's fears. If they find out about this, about us, they'll use it to force me out. Won't matter what the actual facts are. The optics alone would be enough. Carson felt the walls closing in. The careful equilibrium they'd maintained suddenly revealed as unsustainable. Maybe we should stop. I can't let Liam be the reason you lose everything you've built. Victoria's response was fierce enough to make Liam briefly unlatch before finding his rhythm again. Liam isn't the reason. He's the only thing keeping me sane. Do you know what it's like to build an empire and feel completely empty inside? To have everything society says should make you happy and still wake up every morning wondering what the point is. She broke down then, first time showing vulnerability beyond that initial day in the break room. Tears streamed freely as she struggled to articulate pain that went deeper than professional concerns. I've spent 6 years trying to have a child, 4 dead babies, an ex-husband who left because I couldn't move on. I built TechVance to fill the void, convinced myself that achievement would substitute for the emptiness. But feeding Liam, being here with you, this makes me feel human in ways quarterly earnings never could. Carson moved to kneel beside the rocking chair, close enough to offer comfort without disrupting Liam's nursing. Then we're more careful. We don't stop. We just get better at hiding it. Victoria's laugh was wet with tears. Better at hiding. From a board that's actively looking for reasons to replace me, from HR that's already investigating, from colleagues who've noticed patterns. How long before someone connects the dots? The question hung unanswered between them because neither had a good solution. They were trapped in an arrangement that addressed real needs: Liam's nutrition, Victoria's grief, Carson's loneliness, but that existed in a space with no legitimate social category. Not quite professional, not quite personal, too complicated for the world to accommodate without judgment. The fifth week brought medical complications that added new layers of anxiety to an already precarious situation. Victoria's milk supply suddenly dropped mid-week, stress from board pressure apparently affecting her body's ability to produce. Liam fussed through a feeding session, unable to get enough, and Victoria's distress was palpable. Carson called Dr. Pierce the next morning, explaining the situation in carefully neutral terms. The doctor suggested starting Liam on solid foods as a backup, a safety net in case Victoria's supply continued to decrease. The recommendation made practical sense, but felt like acknowledging the fundamental instability of their arrangement, building Liam's nutrition around a variable that could disappear at any moment. That evening, Carson broached the subject while Victoria attempted to nurse Liam with limited success. Dr. Pierce thinks we should start solids, not to replace you, but to give Liam alternatives in case your supply changes. Victoria's expression flickered with something that looked like hurt before settling back into careful neutrality. Of course, whatever's best for Liam. The tension that entered the room suggested they'd touched something deeper than feeding logistics. Some fear Victoria carried about becoming dispensable once her primary function could be replaced by jars of pureed vegetables and rice cereal. Carson recognized the insecurity because he'd felt it himself during those early months when Liam's rejection of formula made Carson feel fundamentally inadequate as a father, incapable of providing the most basic sustenance his child required. He moved to kneel beside the rocking chair again, maintaining eye contact while choosing words carefully. This isn't about replacing you. You're not just a milk source, Victoria. You're Liam's godmother in every way that matters. The person who saved his life when nobody else could. Nothing about introducing solid food changes that. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She blinked back furiously, nodding acceptance even as her body language revealed ongoing struggle with the implications. I know. I just keep waiting for the moment this all falls apart, for my body to fail the way it's failed at everything else related to motherhood. The fact that nursing Liam works feels like borrowed time, like I'm getting something I don't deserve, and eventually the universe will notice the accounting error and take it back. The vulnerability in her admission broke Carson's heart, exposing how deeply Victoria's repeated losses had eroded her ability to trust good things when they appeared. He covered her free hand with his own, squeezing gently while searching for words that might penetrate the fear. You deserve this. Deserve to experience motherhood, even if it's not in the conventional way you imagine. Liam is thriving because of you, and that's not an accounting error or borrowed time. That's you giving something precious to a baby who desperately needed it. They sat together while Liam finished nursing with improved success. The supply issue apparently temporary, related to hydration and stress rather than permanent decrease. When Victoria finally transferred the sleeping baby to his crib and returned to the living room, she moved directly into Carson's arms, seeking comfort and physical contact that had become as essential as the feeding arrangement that brought them together. Her whisper was muffled against his chest. I'm terrified of losing this, losing you and Liam, and this feeling of being needed for something beyond quarterly earnings and shareholder value. Carson held her tighter, understanding the fear because he carried his own version, anxiety about what would happen when their secret inevitably leaked, when the inherent instability of their arrangement finally collapsed under its own weight. But some fears couldn't be resolved through planning or preparation, could only be acknowledged and carried forward. His response was quiet but firm. Then we make the most of what we have right now, today. Stop borrowing tomorrow's problems and focus on the fact that tonight Liam is healthy and we're together, and that's enough. The philosophy sounded better than it probably was, borrowed optimism masking genuine concern about sustainability. But sometimes borrowed optimism was all anyone had when the alternative was drowning in catastrophic what-ifs that might never materialize. The sixth week Carson had been dreading, delivered via an email from TechCrunch that pinged his phone at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning while he was preparing Liam's breakfast. The subject line made his stomach drop before he even opened the message. Ice Queen's secret: TechVance CEO spotted in unexpected location. The article included photographs someone had taken of Victoria entering Carson's apartment building 3 evenings in a row, time-stamped images that proved pattern rather than coincidence. The journalist didn't know about Liam, didn't understand the actual nature of Victoria's visits, but didn't need accurate information to cause catastrophic damage. The speculation alone was enough. Paragraphs wondering about inappropriate relationships between executives and subordinates, questions about whether this represented abuse of power or favoritism that violated TechVance's ethics policies. Carson's name wasn't mentioned, the reporter apparently unable to identify which specific apartment Victoria had been visiting, but that protection felt temporary, a brief reprieve before someone connected the dots and his identity became public knowledge. Victoria's text arrived 30 seconds after Carson finished reading. "We need to talk. Now." He called his mother instead, explaining the situation in rapid sentences while simultaneously getting Liam dressed and fed, Maggie's voice on speaker providing the grounding presence he desperately needed while his world tilted sideways. Her response was calmer than Carson expected, carrying the practical wisdom of someone who'd navigated crises through action rather than panic. Her words were clear. "Baby, you knew this was a possibility when you started this arrangement. The question now isn't how to hide it, that ship has sailed. The question is whether you tell the truth or let speculation fill the vacuum." Carson hadn't considered telling the truth as a viable option, had assumed their only play was denial and misdirection. But his mother's suggestion made him pause mid-diaper change, considering angles he hadn't thought to examine. "If we tell the truth, Victoria loses her job. The board won't tolerate a CEO in this kind of situation, regardless of the actual facts." Maggie's response came firm and certain. "Maybe. Or maybe honesty buys you more grace than lies. Maybe people understand grief and loss in desperate measures better than you think. Either way, you can't control the outcome, only whether you face it with integrity or deception." The advice settled in Carson's chest with uncomfortable weight, demanding he consider options that felt terrifying in their potential consequences. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of anxious energy as Carson navigated getting Liam ready and himself to the office, his phone lighting up with messages from colleagues asking if he'd seen the article, if he knew anything about what was happening with Victoria. The TechVance office felt electric with gossip when Carson arrived. Engineers clustered around computer screens, reading the TechCrunch piece and offering theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. Nobody connected him to the story yet, his anonymity providing temporary shelter from the speculation storm. But Carson knew that protection wouldn't last. Someone would remember seeing Victoria near his desk, or notice she left around the same time he did, or piece together fragments that individually meant nothing but collectively told an accurate story. Victoria's emergency all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10, the entire company summoned to the main auditorium for an announcement that the calendar invite described only as critical company update. Carson attended because absence would draw more attention than presence, settling into a back row with his heart rate climbing toward levels usually reserved for actual medical emergencies. Victoria walked onto the stage at 10 precisely, her posture rigid with the control Carson recognized from moments when she was barely holding herself together through sheer force of will. She wore her trademark severe black suit, hair pulled into that painfully tight bun, every inch the Ice Queen CEO who'd built a billion-dollar company through strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. But Carson could see the cracks in her armor, the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the podium, the tightness around her eyes that suggested she'd been crying recently, the way her jaw clenched as she prepared to detonate whatever bomb she'd assembled. Her voice projected through speakers that carried it to every corner of the packed auditorium. 1,500 employees collectively holding their breath while Victoria prepared to address speculations that had consumed the company since the TechCrunch article published. Victoria's opening words cut through the auditorium silence like a scalpel through tissue. Many of you have seen the TechCrunch article that published this morning. The article speculates about inappropriate relationships and ethics violations based on photographs of me visiting an employee's residence over several weeks. I'm here to address those speculations directly rather than allowing rumor and misinformation to fill the vacuum. The room went completely silent, 1,500 employees collectively frozen while their CEO prepared to either confirm or deny the scandal consuming every conversation since 7:30 that morning. Carson's hands gripped the armrests of his seat hard enough to make his knuckles ache, watching Victoria stand alone on that stage, with nothing but brutal honesty between her and professional destruction. Her voice strengthened as she continued. 6 weeks ago, I experienced my 4th pregnancy loss. My daughter Emma died at 18 weeks gestation, the latest in a series of miscarriages that have defined my attempts at motherhood for the past 6 years. In the immediate aftermath, my body continued producing milk due to sustained pregnancy hormones, a biological response that occurs in some women following late-term loss. The collective gasp that rippled through the auditorium felt like a physical force, shock radiating outward as employees processed information that violated every assumption about their CEO's private life. Carson felt his breathing stop as he realized what Victoria was about to reveal. The magnitude of her choice to go public hitting him like a freight train. Victoria's composure cracked slightly, tears visible on her face despite the bright stage lighting, but she pushed forward with the same determination that had built a company from nothing. At the same time, one of our engineers was struggling with his 8-month-old son who had severe feeding difficulties, rejecting all formula brands and dropping to dangerously low weight percentiles that threatened to require hospitalization. When I held this baby, my body responded by letting down milk, and the infant nursed for the first time since his mother's death during childbirth 8 months prior. The auditorium erupted into chaos, whispers, gasps, the sound of 1,500 people trying to process information that rewrote everything they thought they knew. Carson held Liam closer in the carrier, strapped to his chest, the baby mercifully sleeping through a moment that was about to expose them both to scrutiny neither had chosen. Victoria waited for the noise to settle before continuing, her voice carrying pain that made Carson's chest constrict in unwanted sympathy. I have spent the last 6 weeks serving as wet nurse to this employee's child, visiting his home each evening to breastfeed an infant who was literally starving because his body couldn't tolerate artificial nutrition. This arrangement has been conducted with full medical supervision, with the knowledge and approval of the baby's pediatrician, and with absolute professional boundaries maintained at all times within this workplace. Her voice cracked on the final sentence, emotion breaking through the clinical delivery, and Carson watched her visibly gather herself before continuing. The Victoria standing on that stage bore no resemblance to the Ice Queen of Silicon Valley. This was someone stripped bare, vulnerable in ways that made the entire auditorium lean forward in collective attention. The next words emerged quieter, but no less devastating. There is no romantic relationship, no abuse of power, no favoritism in hiring or promotion or compensation. There is only a woman who lost her 4th child trying to experience at least part of motherhood by helping an infant who desperately needed what her body could provide. Carson watched Victoria's mask shatter completely, watched the CEO facade crumble to reveal someone profoundly human and hurting underneath. But then she paused, looked directly at him in the back row, even though she couldn't possibly see him clearly through stage lights. and the truth he'd been dreading spilled out anyway. Her voice went soft, almost inaudible. That's not entirely true. The auditorium noise cut off instantly, every person straining to hear what came next. Victoria's admission emerged raw and unfiltered. There was no romantic relationship when this started. It was purely medical, purely about helping a baby survive. But somewhere in 6 weeks of feeding this child, of experiencing a shadow of motherhood, of finding someone who understood grief in ways nobody else could, I fell in love with his father. The explosion of sound that followed was deafening. Carson sat frozen while chaos erupted around him, colleagues turning to stare as connections clicked into place. The engineer with the baby, the one who'd been bringing Liam to work for months, the widower everyone knew had lost his wife during childbirth. Within seconds, phones were out, people were pointing, and Carson's anonymity evaporated like fog under sunlight. Victoria's voice cut through the noise one final time, amplified and commanding despite the tears streaming freely. I am resigning as CEO, effective immediately. Not because I believe I did anything wrong, but because I understand this situation compromises my ability to lead effectively, regardless of the actual facts. The board has already accepted my resignation, and interim leadership will be announced within the hour. Carson felt the world tilt sideways, everything he'd feared condensing into reality as Victoria systematically destroyed her career to protect the truth about what they'd been doing. He wanted to stand up, to shout that she didn't need to do this, that they could find another way to manage the fallout. But moving would identify him as the employee in question more definitively than any speculation, would expose Liam to the judgment and scrutiny Victoria was trying to shield them from by taking full responsibility. Victoria's final words carried weight that would echo long after she left the stage. I want to be absolutely clear about one thing. I have built this company from nothing into something that employs 1,500 people and creates value for millions of customers. I am proud of that work, proud of what we've accomplished together. But the last 6 weeks, nursing this baby, experiencing a shadow of what motherhood might have been, has meant more to me than any acquisition or product launch or valuation milestone. She paused, letting the statement settle over an auditorium so quiet Carson could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. We build companies. We chase valuations and market share and competitive advantage. But sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply help another human being survive. That's what I chose to do. And I would make the same choice again, regardless of the professional cost. The auditorium erupted as Victoria stepped off stage, employees shouting questions that went unanswered as she disappeared through the side exit. Carson sat frozen in his seat while people around him debated and speculated and argued about what they just witnessed, Liam waking and starting to fuss against his chest. He needed to leave before someone approached with questions he wasn't ready to answer, needed to get out of this building before the full weight of public exposure crushed him. But Grace Winters appeared at his row before he could move, leaning down to whisper urgently, "Miss Blackwell asked that you bring Liam to her office. She's waiting." Carson followed Grace through hallways that felt surreal, passing colleagues who were too absorbed in processing Victoria's announcement to notice him slipping toward the executive elevator. The 20th floor was eerily quiet when they arrived, most of the C-suite executives presumably in emergency sessions with legal and PR trying to manage the fallout. Grace ushered him into Victoria's office and closed the door, leaving Carson alone with the woman who just sacrificed everything to protect their secret. Victoria stood by the window, overlooking the bay, her back to him, shoulders shaking with sobs she'd suppressed during the public announcement. Carson crossed to her without thinking, Liam between them as he wrapped his arms around her from behind, feeling her body shake with the force of released emotion. His voice came out hoarse. "You didn't have to resign. We could have found another way." Victoria turned in his arms, her face destroyed by tears and grief, and something that might have been relief underneath the devastation. "Yes, I did. The board gave me an ultimatum this morning: end the arrangement and submit to ethics investigation, or resign immediately. I couldn't end this. Couldn't abandon Liam when he's still dependent on me. Couldn't walk away from the only thing that's made me feel human in years. She reached for Liam, taking him from Carson's arms and holding him close while fresh tears streamed down her face. I built an empire, Carson. Created something that will outlast me and employ thousands of people and generate billions in value. But I couldn't create life. Couldn't carry a pregnancy to term. Couldn't be a mother in the way I desperately wanted. Her voice dropped to a whisper raw with pain that went back years. This baby, your son, gave me the only taste of motherhood I'll probably ever experience. How could I choose corporate leadership over that? How could I prioritize a job title over the chance to be needed by someone who doesn't care about my net worth or market position? Carson understood then that this hadn't been a choice for Victoria, not really, that her decision to resign had been inevitable the moment the board forced her to pick between professional reputation and personal meaning. She'd spent 6 years chasing motherhood through fertility treatments and repeated loss, had built walls of professional achievement around the emptiness where children should have been. And Liam had finally given her access to the things she actually wanted beneath all the corporate success. His words were quiet but certain. What happens now? Victoria wiped her eyes, attempting to compose herself while still holding Liam close. Now I figure out who I am without the CEO title. Start the foundation I've been planning for years to help women dealing with infertility and pregnancy loss. Continue being Liam's godmother and wet nurse for as long as my body cooperates. She met Carson's gaze directly, vulnerability mixing with determination. And if you'll have me, I'd like to try building something real with you. Not a secret arrangement we hide from the world, but an actual relationship where we figure out what this is and where it's going. Carson felt something unlock in his chest. Permission to want this fully instead of carefully. To pursue Victoria without the constant fear of professional consequences, now that those consequences had already materialized. I love you. Have loved you for weeks but was too scared to say it clearly. You gave up everything for Liam, for me, and I don't know how to process that level of sacrifice. Victoria kissed him then, proper and deep, Liam squirming between them, but tolerating the contact with his usual good nature. When they separated, something lighter had entered Victoria's expression, despite the tears. Something that suggested relief at no longer maintaining the exhausting facade. Her voice was soft. I didn't give up everything. I gave up a job that was slowly killing me, that demanded I be someone I'm not, that required suppressing everything that makes me human. What I got in return is worth infinitely more. The following 48 hours passed in a blur of media attention that transformed Victoria from Ice Queen CEO to polarizing figure in debates about motherhood, corporate leadership, and the boundaries of appropriate workplace relationships. The initial TechCrunch article spawned hundreds of follow-ups. Op-eds arguing both sides, think pieces about wet nursing and modern parenting and women's bodies, profile pieces that dug into Victoria's fertility struggles and Carson's status as a widower raising a child alone. Carson's identity leaked within 24 hours, despite his name never being mentioned in Victoria's speech. His LinkedIn profile suddenly flooded with connection requests from journalists, his apartment building besieged by photographers hoping for images of him and Victoria together, his phone ringing constantly with interview requests he didn't answer. Maggie flew out from Pittsburgh despite her heart condition, arriving with enough motherly concern and practical support to help Carson navigate the chaos. She took one look at Victoria when they met properly, the former CEO showing up at Carson's apartment for the evening feeding while camera flashes went off in the parking lot below, and pulled her into a hug that lasted long enough to make Victoria cry again. Maggie's words were simple when they separated. Thank you for saving my grandson. Thank you for loving him enough to give up everything. The public response split sharply along predictable lines. Conservative commentators condemned the arrangement as inappropriate, regardless of circumstances. Their outrage fueled by discomfort with women's bodies and non-traditional family structures. Progressive voices celebrated Victoria's choice to prioritize personal meaning over corporate achievement, her story becoming a rallying cry for work-life balance and authentic living. But underneath the political noise, something unexpected emerged. Support from mothers who'd struggled with breastfeeding or infant feeding difficulties. Women sharing stories about wet nursing arrangements that had saved their children. Acknowledgement that sometimes survival required unconventional solutions. 3 weeks after Victoria's resignation, a producer from a major morning show reached out requesting an interview. Carson and Victoria debated the wisdom of further exposure, ultimately deciding that controlling their narrative mattered more than hiding from ongoing speculation. They needed to tell their story in their own words before someone else defined it for them. The interview aired on a Tuesday morning, both of them sitting on a studio couch while Liam played between them, answering questions about how they'd met, why Victoria had agreed to nurse someone else's child, what their relationship had become in the aftermath of public exposure. The host, a woman in her 50s who'd built her career on empathetic but probing interviews, asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. Her voice carried genuine curiosity. Victoria, you were one of the most powerful CEOs in Silicon Valley. You gave that up for a baby who isn't biologically yours, for a relationship that violates conventional boundaries. Do you regret it? Victoria looked at Liam, then at Carson, her expression completely open in ways the Ice Queen would never have allowed. I spent 6 years and over $400,000 trying to have a biological child. 4 pregnancies, 4 losses, each one taking a piece of my soul I'll never get back. I built a billion-dollar company thinking that achievement would fill the void, that professional success would compensate for not being a mother. She paused, choosing words with the same care she'd once applied to board presentations. Nursing Liam taught me that meaning doesn't come from valuations or market share. It comes from being needed by someone who doesn't care about your accomplishments, who just wants you present and available, and willing to give them what they require to survive. I don't regret giving up the CEO position. I regret that it took me 42 years and 4 dead children to understand what actually mattered. The interview went viral within hours, clips circulating on social media with commentary that ranged from supportive to vicious. But Carson noticed something shifting in the overall discourse. Mothers coming forward with stories about cross-nursing and milk sharing, medical professionals defending the practice as safe and beneficial when done with appropriate screening, the shame and scandal that initially dominated coverage beginning to give way to more nuanced discussion about different paths to motherhood and how grief could intersect with joy in ways that defied conventional categories. Pierce called a week after the interview aired, her voice carrying satisfaction Carson hadn't heard in their previous conversations. I've received over 300 calls from mothers asking about wet nursing arrangements for babies with feeding difficulties. Your story is changing how people think about this, Carson, making it acceptable again to seek help in ways that were normal for most of human history. The observation landed with unexpected weight, suggesting that their private arrangement had somehow become public advocacy, their survival strategy transformed into permission for other families facing similar crises. Carson wasn't sure how he felt about that, being unwilling poster children for wet nursing and non-traditional family structures, but he couldn't deny the stream of messages from grateful parents thanking them for normalizing something that had saved their children. 6 months after Victoria's resignation, she officially launched the Emma's Legacy Foundation with an initial commitment of $200 million focused on supporting women through infertility, pregnancy loss, and alternative paths to motherhood. The foundation funded milk banks across California, provided grants for IVF treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, offered counseling for families navigating adoption and surrogacy, created support groups for women dealing with recurrent pregnancy loss. Victoria poured into the work the same intensity she'd brought to building Tech Vance, but now directed toward helping others avoid the isolation and repeated devastation she'd experienced. She hired staff, established partnerships with hospitals and fertility clinics, created educational programs about wet nursing and milk donation. The foundation became her new empire, smaller in financial terms, but infinitely more meaningful in human impact. Carson transitioned to a position at a smaller startup where his skills were valued, but the pressure felt manageable, where leaving at reasonable hours to help with Liam didn't mark him as insufficiently committed to the mission. The pay cut was significant enough to notice, but survivable with careful budgeting, and the reduced stress made him a better father and partner than he could have been while grinding through 80-hour weeks at TechVance. Liam thrived in ways that suggested the early feeding difficulties hadn't caused lasting damage. He started walking at 11 months, speaking his first words shortly after his first birthday, growing into a cheerful toddler who split his attachment equally between Carson and Victoria. The nursing continued until Liam was 15 months old, when Victoria's supply finally began decreasing as solid foods largely replaced breast milk in his diet. The transition was gradual and gentle, Victoria's body slowly relinquishing a function it had maintained far longer than medical literature suggested was typical for induced lactation. On a Saturday morning, 18 months after that first shocking discovery in the 20th floor break room, Carson found himself at San Francisco City Hall with a small group assembled for a wedding nobody had expected when this journey began. Victoria wore a simple cream dress, her hair down and natural, with no trace of the Ice Queen remaining in the woman smiling at him, while they exchanged vows witnessed by Maggie, a few close friends, and Liam in a tiny suit acting as ring bearer with enthusiastic incompetence. The ceremony was brief and intimate, focusing on the journey that brought them here rather than conventional wedding script. The officiant, a friend of Maggie's who'd flown out from Pittsburgh, spoke about paths that don't follow expected routes, about finding family in unexpected places, about love that emerges from shared grief and builds something stronger than romance alone could sustain. When the officiant pronounced them married, Carson kissed his wife while their son giggled and clapped, and everything that had seemed impossible 2 years ago crystallized into a reality more meaningful than anything Carson could have planned or predicted. The world had told them this was inappropriate, scandalous, destined to fail. The world had been wrong about everything except the one thing that mattered. It had worked. They'd survived the scandal and built something real from the wreckage of their separate griefs. The reception was tiny, held in a restaurant they'd rented for the afternoon, intimate enough that conversation flowed naturally rather than being drowned in formal speeches. Maggie gave a toast that made Victoria cry happy tears, talking about grace showing up in unexpected packages and the courage it took to accept blessings that arrived wrapped in uncomfortable truths. During their first dance, swaying to music in a nearly empty room while Liam toddled between tables supervised by Maggie, Carson's voice was soft against Victoria's ear. "I still can't believe this worked, that we survived the scandal and built something real." Victoria pulled back enough to meet his eyes, her expression radiant in ways that had nothing to do with makeup or strategic image management. "We survived because we stopped pretending, stopped hiding what we needed and who we were and what mattered beyond professional reputation. Turns out honesty and vulnerability are more powerful than any corporate strategy." Later that evening, after guests had departed and Liam was sleeping peacefully at Maggie's hotel room, giving them one night alone, Carson and Victoria sat on the couch in what was now their shared apartment, larger than his original place but still modest by standards Victoria could easily afford. They'd chosen Mission District deliberately, wanting to stay grounded in the neighborhood where this had started, rather than retreating to some penthouse that would isolate them from normal life. Carson's question emerged tentative. "Do you miss it? TechVance and the CEO title, and the power that came with leading a billion-dollar company?" Victoria considered seriously, not offering easy platitudes but genuine reflection on what she'd traded for this life. I miss the intellectual challenge sometimes, the satisfaction of solving complex problems, of building something that scales, of seeing strategy translate into results. But I don't miss the person I had to become to succeed in that world. Don't miss the isolation or the constant performance or the way achievement never actually filled the emptiness. She shifted to face him more directly, her hand finding his with the natural ease of long practice. Liam saved my life, Carson, not metaphorically or dramatically, but actually saved me from a path that was destroying me slowly. He gave me permission to want something beyond professional success, to acknowledge that building companies wasn't what I actually needed. Carson understood, having traveled his own version of that journey from the person he'd been when Julia died to who he'd become through 18 months of learning that being a good father mattered more than impressing managers or climbing corporate ladders. They sat together in comfortable silence, the city lights visible through windows that overlooked a neighborhood where actual families lived instead of tech millionaires, where children played in parks and people knew their neighbors' names. The next morning, Liam woke them at 6 after Maggie delivered him back, the toddler climbing into bed between them, demanding breakfast with the imperious tone of someone who knew he was loved unconditionally. Victoria scooped him up, carrying him toward the kitchen while Carson followed, the three of them moving through morning routines that had become familiar through repetition. Watching Victoria make pancakes while Liam banged on his high chair tray, Carson felt gratitude for the unlikely path that brought them here, for the grief that intersected in ways neither could have predicted, for a baby's desperate hunger meeting a woman's equally desperate need to nurture. They'd built something real from broken pieces, had created family from circumstances that should have remained professional boundaries. The world might debate whether their arrangement had been appropriate or scandalous or revolutionary, but for the three people eating breakfast together in a San Francisco apartment while morning light streamed through east-facing windows, the only thing that mattered was this: they'd survived, they'd found each other, and they built something worth more than any corporate valuation could measure.